So welcome back to Mind and Reality. Having so much fun. We're already on lecture 7. Things are moving quickly now. In the previous lecture, I encourage you to think, this is a key question. What are the functions of perceptual awareness? In order to understand perceptual awareness, we need to know what it's good for, what its functions are. And I also suggested that that was related to another question. And that second question will be the question for today's lecture. The question is this one: can you perceive something without being perceptually aware of it? Now I think answering this question is going to help us to answer this question. Strip away the perceptual awareness. What's left? And I will also be giving you answers to the seminar task that you are rewriting for the seminars next week. Anybody know who this is? This is Dretske, famous philosopher, also an absolute master of distinctions. Why do I mention this? Well, our question is about whether you can have perception without perceptual awareness. And you might be thinking, well, Steve, that's kind of trivial. So I've just given you an example of that. You just perceived Dretske, sure, but you were not aware that this thing here that you were perceiving is Dretske. So you might say, Steve, that is a case of perception without awareness. I perceived it, but I was unaware of some fact about it. And I want to say to you, well, you can define it that way, but then of course it is trivial whether or not you can perceive things without having perceptual awareness. The answer is manifestly yes. Dretske says what we've got to do is distinguish between that interpretation of our question, which makes it trivial, and a more interesting interpretation where you perceive an object but are unaware of it. And of course what just happened wasn't a type 2 case of perception without awareness. You can't tell me that you perceived this but were unaware of it. You can tell me that you perceived it but unaware that it was Dretske, master of distinctions. Didn't know that, or maybe you did, right? Could have been in that situation. So if we want our question about perception without awareness to be non-trivial, then we best interpret it in this second way. It's a matter of perceiving an object while being unaware of it. And that's just what Dretske tells us we ought to do. He writes, perception without awareness, unconscious perception, is to be understood as perception of some object without awareness, consciousness, of that object. So I hope that's clear by thinking about the trivial sense in which you had perception without awareness when I showed you Dretske, and the interesting sense in which we claim, perhaps, that there can be perception without awareness. Now, before we go on, there's one further matter that I feel we absolutely need to address here. You will notice that Dretske here is using two words for one thing. So he says perception without awareness, unconscious perception. He wants to mark that those are one and the same thing. Now I want to say this is something that I disapprove of very strongly. If you're using two words, I expect you to be talking about two different things. Otherwise, why would you be using two words? If you're using one word, I expect you to be talking about the same thing. Otherwise, why wouldn't you be using two different words? See how simple that is? We're trying to communicate difficult ideas in the simplest possible way. And one thing that's very important to do is to hold on to this idea of one thing you're talking about one word, two things you're talking about two words. But Dretske here has violated that requirement. And indeed, if you were listening carefully, I did the same in the previous lecture. I'm afraid, folks, that's unavoidable. That's just how philosophers have been so badly behaved. The important thing to take away here is that in your own writing, first of all, please don't do this. But secondly, when you're reading what other people write, you don't need to make a distinction between perception without awareness and unconscious perception. Maybe all kinds of distinctions to be made here, but those terms are not pointing to a useful distinction. Crucial point, perception without awareness is to be understood as perception of some object without awareness of that object. Is there perception without awareness?